In a world that's always racing forward, sometimes we need to slow down and reconnect.
Connect genuinely, broaden your perspective, and share your passion.
Bona fide dialogues, where authenticity, creativity, and passion merge. Coby Lefkowitz is a co-founder and partner of Backyard, an innovative real estate development firm with offices in Southern California and New York that works on delivering infill multifamily projects in walkable communities. Coby is a leading writer within the worlds of urban planning and real estate development, with a focus on exploring how to promote more resilient, walkable, dynamic, and people-oriented communities at the intersection of development, urban design, and finance. A graduate of the University of Virginia, Coby holds a Bachelor of Science in Urban and Environmental Planning and a certificate from the McIntire School of Commerce.
Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining Bonafide Dialogues.
Christina, such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for welcoming me on.
Let's just dive in right away. Can you please tell me about your journey into urban development and real estate development? Why did you decide to pursue career in this field?
I don't know if any of us has a choice over what we want to decide. We're sort of drawn to it, right? And from a very early age, I was drawn into real estate development. I grew up in and around New York, and when you see the tall buildings at a very early age, it brings you in, right? There's this deep romance and skyscrapers and the liveliness of New York City. And I always wanted to contribute to that. Originally, I thought that meant being an architect. So I took some classes in high school. I ended up going to architecture school at university, and I loved it, but I was terrible. I just did not have the skill to be an architect. And so I thought, well, how can I still be involved in this world if I'm not the one drawing the plans, if I'm not designing the building itself? And I learned about real estate development. Finance sounded interesting to me. Being able to control some of the decisions certainly sounded interesting to me. I know a lot of architects and developers share that intrigue, and it allowed me to have more interactions at other parts of the process. So you're not just controlling design, you're talking to city officials, you're talking to attorneys, to urban planners, to any number of folks in order to get a project delivered. And that was really compelling to me. You were sort of, in some respects, perhaps the closest analog, like in California, is a producer of a movie. You bring all of these different parts together in service of single vision, similar to a composer, an orchestra as well. And that is at once empowering and exciting. It also is a little bit nerve-wracking because there's a lot of pressure on your shoulders if you're the single party, even with a number of partners who's bringing this about. So I quickly learned architecture wasn't for me. I want to be involved in the built environment. I'd like to do development. And out of school, I worked for a number of firms, from institutional, publicly traded companies to smaller boutique real estate development firms, doing work in Brooklyn predominantly, but we worked around the country, looked at different markets. And as any developer, I think, will tell you, ultimately, you want to be able to run your own projects. It's great to work for a big company, but if you have the vision, you have the passion, you want to see stuff that is a representation of you, right? And so more than almost 4 years ago now, I started having conversations with my now partners about creating our own firm. And 3 years ago, we made the leap, and we've been developing in Southern California and New York ever since.
Yes, I looked at those houses. I think it's in San Diego, right?
That's right.
I like that there's a lot of light. I like the design.
It was very important for us, or at least for me. I won't speak on behalf of my partners. Coming from New York, where we have 4 seasons, which is fantastic. I love the fall, I love the winter, I love that they're discrete. But in Southern California, it's 75 and sunny most of the year. You should take advantage of that. And my first time I went to San Diego, I'd spent some time in Los Angeles, but hadn't been to San Diego before I started this partnership. I was amazed that so much of the city was reserved for the private realm, and that it didn't maximize the magnificent environment that is Southern California. There's not a lot of public park space. There are often in apartment buildings no courtyards. There's a lot of parking everywhere. So there's concrete and asphalt. There's not a lot of places where people can bring light into. So it was important for us in our first couple of projects to maximize that California spirit when you're within your home or without of it. So we've done our best to bring light in. There's always more work that can be done, of course. One funny note on our second project, which is now just finished construction, one of the framers, when we were first putting up the structure, remarked at us, half joking, I didn't know that we're building a cathedral because we have this grand lofted ceiling. It's 20 feet tall and these
I love that.
really beautiful windows. And so we're building apartments, but to some we're building mini cathedrals.
Are you developing your own signature?
It's a great question, and one that I'm torn on, because I have strong affinities towards contemporary architecture, but likewise traditional architecture. And as someone who went to architecture school, I studied for many years and continue to do my own studies on various different typologies and styles of architecture. And if you ask me, not even on a different day, but if you ask me in a different hour, I'll give you a separate answer. Maybe I Tudor revival in this moment. In another, it might be arts and crafts. In a third, it could be contemporary, something that Zaha Hadid or Bjarke Ingels has designed. So with saying that, it's difficult for me to pinpoint a specific style that I'd want to move into a trademark. I think it's all contextual. So if we're doing work in Southern California, we want to use light tones. We want to let in as much light as possible. We want to maximize the outdoor space. But if we're building in upstate New York or the Pacific Northwest or some other city that today we're not operating in, but perhaps we might be, we have to respond more to that context. And so I want to be very mindful of not copying and pasting what works in one place and doing it another. Every place is different, and we have to respect and honor those local traditions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Of course, you want to leave this legacy, and be recognizable. If somebody looks at the building, oh, I know, whose idea, who worked on it, who developed the idea and built it. But I hear what you're saying. It's very important to be mindful of the environment, of the culture and the demographics and weather, and so many different things you need to consider when you develop a new community, because you can't think about the building as a standalone building. You have to consider everything around it, like you said, parks and streets and shops. And it must be very difficult to create new community because you have to consider all those things, right?
And oftentimes there's a neglect of that, and we can feel that, right? There are certain buildings or streets or neighborhoods that you walk through, and one can feel the love and the pride that's imbued in them. But unfortunately, more pervasively, we feel that homogeneity that's sort of been a monotony that's been paved across the landscape, that something that's built in Tampa is just as good as Tacoma, when of course the local ecologies, demographics, and context of Florida and Washington State couldn't be more different. And so there has been, I think, an epidemic of this negligence of context. And in our very small way, and those kindred spirits who we're connected with, we can bring about a change. And I shouldn't say that we're at the forefront of this. We are certainly standing on the shoulders of many who have come before us. But in this group of more enlightened, thoughtful, and considerate developers, I do believe that we will win the day, and the quality of the projects that we're delivering are a testament to that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I put my house on the market this month, and I see many people, Asian people come in, and they walk away right away, because when you open the door, I have stairs going to the second floor, And apparently in their culture, it's bad luck, you will have problems with finances.
In Feng Shui, a traditional Chinese philosophy of harmonizing individuals with their surrounding environment, having stairs directly facing the front door is considered bad luck or poor energy flow. Feng Shui principles emphasize the importance of qi, the life force or energy that flows through a space, and how it affects well-being, prosperity, and health. When stairs are positioned directly in front of the main entrance, the concern is that the energy entering the house through the front door will rush upward or downward through the stairs, leading to imbalanced energy throughout the home. This can manifest as problems in other areas of wealth, health, and stability. Other cultures that have adopted aspects of Feng Shui, particularly in modern design, may also avoid this layout for similar reasons.
So I was thinking, as a developer, you have to consider so many things, cultural differences, and so many nuances. Very, very, very interesting.
That's right. It's a risky game being a developer in many respects. And it's very important to be cognizant of who you're building for. So it could be cultural differences, it could be familial differences or family composition. Are you building for someone who has 3 kids, or are you building for someone who's a student? Are you building for someone who wants to be able to walk to work or to see their friends, or someone who's commuting? And one risks this becoming too anonymized and depersonalized very quickly, because it's easier to build a very standardized sort of product that tries to grab the largest audience possible. Indeed, that's entirely rational. There are some folks who lament the state of our built environment and blame the builders as maybe being profane in some respect or ignorant, but they're not. They're highly rational agents and very smart, because they're building to capture the largest net possible.
Yeah.
But when we do that, we lose out on the essential character of a place. And so it's a delicate balance that must be struck, that I don't have any answers for, of course. All that we attempt to do, whether through our work or consulting and talking with others, is to bring that balance a little bit closer to what a regional vernacular might be, or more consideration of who the ultimate tenant is, as opposed to a very standardized and pro forma product.
Yeah, and it's a good point. You want to customize it for your community, but at the same time, you don't want to segregate communities. I don't know how I feel about retirement communities, for example. I would like to have everybody's mixed and living together and learning from each other and interacting.
This is something that I've talked a lot about, and there are members of the urbanist community who, and developers as well, who have taken up the question of, let's say, families in cities. A lot of the new supply of housing in expensive metro areas is comprised of studios and one bedrooms, because it's the most economically viable and efficient types of units to build. If you can rent a studio for $2,000 a month, or you can rent a 3-bedroom for $5,000 a month, let's just make it up. And perhaps it might even be less than that. You can build 3 studios at least, and let's say they're 500 square feet, and the 3 bedrooms is 1,500 square feet in the same space as a 3-bedroom, and make more money.
Yeah.
So it makes rational sense that you should do that. And once you capitalize this with cap rates and valuation, the math makes even more sense. But we lose families in that equation. And you get to a situation where there is a segregation in demographics, where young folks live in the heart of the city and families live in what are known as bedroom communities, because the workers in the household, whether it's one member, one parent, or both, will sleep at home and then they'll commute into the city. And there is this rather transactional and superficial relationship with the city, as opposed to a comprehensive community. And I do worry that not only does that break down along family composition lines, age lines? It certainly does with retirement communities. Demographic lines, class lines is a really big one where, for various reasons, we have seen an increase in the rates of concentrated poverty by a census tract, which is very concerning to me because there's robust research that when one grows up in a neighborhood with higher proportions of impoverishment, they have lesser access to opportunity in their future. And that does not mean that folks who are impoverished are the reason why there is a deprivable opportunity. It's just that those neighborhoods may be less funded. There's less resources that are going into them. There are less role models in those communities in the sense of you might not have a lawyer or a doctor.
Activities for children, right?
For children, all of these things, and those issues compound. So we should seek to build communities that are as accessible as possible to as broad a swath of people as possible. And once we visit these places, we immediately know and feel their quality, right? And it's often the case in New York. You'll walk around and feel that something is very off. You go, well, I haven't seen a kid, anyone younger than 12 in a couple of days. I haven't seen someone who's older, who's in their 70s or 80s in a couple of days. It feels like a campus almost in some respects, which is not how we should be building our cities.
Yes, and you just mentioned this sleeping communities. I live in the Bay Area, and I spent more than a decade going to downtown San Francisco Financial District. That's where I work. I don't want to even try to calculate how many hours of my life I wasted in traffic. It's terrible. So I don't know how to solve that, but this is the way life is in the US.
Yeah, it's a real problem. I believe that the Bay Area, and I could be wrong, this may be old data, has the highest proportion of super commuters in the US. I believe it's folks who are commuting more than an hour and a half each way. So you'll see people commuting from Richmond or from Sacramento or some smaller communities further afield to, Stockton. You're spending 3 hours of your day in a car. It's not healthy. You're not moving. Stressors because you're sitting in traffic all day, so your blood pressure rises. All manner of insalubrious outcomes. And there's actually a very simple way to solve it. It's not an intractable problem at all. We must simply build more housing in proximate locations to amenities. So much of San Francisco is almost offensively low rise for one of the most highly productive regions on earth. If you are 3 miles outside of the financial district or 4 miles in the outer Richmond or outer Sunset, a majority of those buildings are 1 and 2 stories. And even the buildings that are 2 stories often have a garage on the first floor.
Yeah.
Those homes simply allowed, or if the neighborhoods were simply allowed to have 3, 4, 5 stories, these aren't skyscrapers by any means. They're eminently human scaled. They are, you can often have a 4 or 5 story single family home, certainly in the case of New York with these brownstones. I've done a calculation on this. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but it's something to the effect of if San Francisco took just 10% of its single family zone land, so not 10% of the city's land, but just 10% of the land that's zoned for single family housing in the city. And I think some number upwards of 70% of the land is zoned for single family homes. So 10% of that, and allowed up to 5 stories of house. And you could imagine that each one of these homes would have a front unit and a back unit on each floor. So we're talking 10 units. These are not very big apartment buildings. Many of the most beautiful buildings in San Francisco are 20, 30, 50, 100 unit apartment buildings. And these are works of staggering beauty. So I'm not even.
No, we're not talking about that. We'll keep that. We'll keep the history and beauty.
Exactly. And you can still keep the history and build lovely. You would be able to build on that land, and I'll have to send over the exact statistics, an amount of housing units that would be able to double the population of San Francisco. without overcrowding it. San Francisco has robust public infrastructure, public transportation infrastructure. You would certainly have to marry this with increased grocery stores and public parks. But San Francisco has amongst the highest rates of greenery of any major American city. It's eminently possible, and it doesn't require you to take up that much land. But we acquiesce to the status quo where we say, people just commute an hour away. That's just what they do. And it shouldn't be that way. You shouldn't have to live so much of your life in the car.
No, no, absolutely not. And before I had to drive to downtown San Francisco, I had to take my son to school every day. And the way schools are built, and I lived in Hercules, there's a one-lane road with 3 schools, elementary, middle school, and high school on the same road. And you have thousands of people dropping off their kids. Every time I drove, and you have no choice, you have to do it for 12 years, right? And every morning you're stuck there. And I was always thinking, somebody sitting in their cubicle was planning it. Did they even think or consider how this is going to affect how many families, how many people it will affect every single day for years?
It's a very good question. And interestingly enough, much of the calculations that underpin, let's say, school district enrollment or the volume of cars that can be transported over certain roads rely on what at first appear to be quite acute calculations and very precise. But of course, they're not, because we sit in traffic. And so there's this joke amongst urbanists and urban planners that we say, well, one more lane will fix it. If you build another lane, and it's funny, when we do build another lane, we actually find that it doesn't fix it, because it's this phenomenon known as induced demand. So of course, there is a certain point at which if you had 20-lane highways with each side, there wouldn't be much traffic. But those highways cost considerable sums of money. And at that point, your entire community becomes getting from A to B and not A to B. So if you're destroying the reasons why you want to be in a place for the sake of getting to that place, that strikes me as pretty backward and counterproductive.
So how do you solve this?
Public transportation is a big part of it, and or making it such that you don't need to drive to drop your kid off this. Maybe you can walk a couple of blocks. Maybe you can bike a couple of blocks. If perhaps the BART train or a bus rapid transit system isn't able to accommodate one in some of these development patterns. We know that this works because there are billions of people around the world who manage just fine, and it seems to be the case that in the Anglosphere and some Gulf nations that have adopted these development patterns, unfortunately, increasingly China, and I say unfortunately because there are hundreds of millions of people that are now living in these very unsustainable development patterns. But most people in the world get on just fine without needing to drive a car from point A to point B.
So we rely on our cars too much. So what you're saying, you have to rethink, not just build more lanes, but actually rethink the way we function in our communities, right?
Building more lanes won't solve it. We've tried that experiment for the last 70 years, and it doesn't work. It only entrenches the existing issues. Whether one cares about, well, the way I'll make this argument to folks, if they're not initially sympathetic to an efficiency perspective, maybe they say from a sustainability or an environmental perspective, we don't want to be paving over more land with asphalt because it leads to stormwater runoff. It leads to the urban heat island effect. So these places are much warmer than others, which leads to deleterious health impacts. You could take nearly any perspective that one wants, that one would care about. Safety of a community. It's far safer for your kid to be able to walk to school than getting them in a car with the rates of car accidents that we have in the United States, right?
And kids are walking and the sidewalk is so narrow. It's like, did anybody think about these things?
Well, it's because we've ceded so much land to cars. So if we were able to just reclaim some of those streets and rework our infrastructure, but this is is much more easily said than done. Unfortunately, we don't operate with a blank slate. We can't go off to have 100 square miles that we can build a city from scratch. We have to operate within the existing frameworks of municipalities, and I know we
Which
talked
is
about
much
this
harder. Yeah.
much harder, especially with the regulatory environment in places like California and New York. It's very, very difficult. But even in other states like Texas and Tennessee and Arizona, one is still subject to the regulations and ordinances of departments of transportation and planning departments, um, which can make things rather difficult as well.
Yeah. You mentioned this issue with traffic. I know Elon Musk was trying to solve it with tunnels. What do you think about that?
I
From
think
the urban planning
from an urban planning perspective,
perspective, yeah.
it's not a good idea.
It's not very interesting.
And the reason why is because it's a very low passenger volume for a large investment. There are engineering considerations that I'm no engineer, and there are figures far better than me to opine on that. But if we just
Oh,
think
if you have your opinion, and we're interested to hear it, definitely from your perspective.
from a planner's perspective, what one would say is if they're all getting in a Tesla, maximum there's 5 people who can get into that, right? So there's a certain amount of time that one takes to get in and get out of the car. Even if there was very high throughput and a new car was coming every 10 seconds,
Yeah.
which would require a significant capital investment that likely is beyond the extent of what municipalities can sustain.
Yeah.
It pales in comparison to the amount of people that a bus, to say nothing of a train, could hold with the same level of throughput, and it requires significant new infrastructural investment. And in the case of Los Angeles, near Hawthorne, where SpaceX was, and where Tesla, I believe, has some engineers, there's such low density at each
Yeah.
location that it requires so many stations and onboardings that it's not viable. This gets back to the notion of density more broadly. And density can be a scary word, but by that I just mean more people getting to share amenities close to each other. New York's subway system and the MTA has many problems, but the reason why it's broadly able to run is because there's millions of people who use the service, and they're able to run lines from various parts of the city because a lot of people make use of it. If you live
That's a scary place. I came from Ukraine, and I was born in Russia, so the subway system there, it's like a museum. So first time I visited New
Moscow
York
subway system
subway,
is
I was shocked.
it is there's a much longer conversation to be had there. We have not
I just want to mention that.
No, it's it
I don't
is
mean to criticize, but I think there's
criticize
something we can
away.
improve, definitely.
It needs criticism. You know, we built the system at the beginning of the 20th century, and we really haven't updated it since. Uh, I don't have the exact statistics offhand, but we've just delivered 3 new stations on the Upper East Side, and by just I mean some 5 or 6 years ago at this point, or maybe 3 or 4, whatever the case is. And we're building 2 to 3 to 4 times more expensive than the next most expensive metro system in the world. And we are celebrating these as accomplishments. Meanwhile, the rest of the system is falling apart. It's not something worth celebrating. There are many other transit systems that are, but you know, one doesn't need to build an entire rail infrastructure to be able to support density. A lot of Latin American cities have proven with great efficiency that bus routes can more than accommodate the needs of a populace in very dignified, clean, and reliable mechanisms. You know, that's often the issue of buses in the United States. There's very low throughput, so you might have one bus every 30 minutes uh, at best. You know, sometimes it's an hour, and that's not reliable, especially if it doesn't get you from your door at point A to point B. You may need to walk a half mile or a mile on either side. Um, a lot more that can be said there, but there are other examples that we can look to as a nation. It just requires us being willing to look outwards, and oftentimes we have a reticence to do that.
And bring some beauty to these projects. Like you
Yeah.
build it, you're already spending so much money. We have so many talented people that will make it beautiful. So we enjoy environments we're in, right? Wherever you're going to work or you're staying at home, you want it to be beautiful.
Unfortunately, well, though that's right. Unfortunately, there are some who disagree with that or who don't hold beauty as a virtue, which is wrong.
Mm.
If one looks at the most beautiful cities in the world, it's a subjective mechanism, right?
Yeah.
Two reasonable people could disagree as to whether Venice or Florence or Kyoto are beautiful. Most people would look at them and say these are extraordinary cities. Um, but it comes down to a cultural value that
Mm.
want to build something that's beautiful. And while we might recognize it if we spend several $1,000s to go some other place in the world to appreciate that, for some reason, we think or we have acquiesced to the status quo that strips away ornamentation and attraction and deprives our ability to feel affection for places from an aesthetic perspective. Um, we've lost that spirit in the United States. Now, there is a renaissance of it. There are many people who are working to create more beautiful communities. But unfortunately, and this is why I said unfortunately at the beginning of this question, a lot of the folks who build our most prominent structures, who are operating our transportation systems or designing our cities, are either agnostic as to what the final result looks like. That's good enough, fine. Or
Mhm. It's
they,
all the same too. It looks the same everywhere. Like, where's
they
this unique personality to each building?
and there's two answers to that, or they'll say on the other side, to part of the homogeneity, we have transcended the need to have regional variation or identity or character, that we're going to have glass buildings, clean lines, hyper rationality. We have reached the end of architectural history. This is the final answer. And it becomes an orthodoxy that many architects and design professionals unfortunately subscribe to because they're the ones who design our built environment. And I that's not to say there aren't contemporary or modern buildings or cities that aren't lovely, but on the whole, I don't know that we can rely on the capabilities of certain design professionals that have not shown themselves to be uh, broadly successful in their efforts and apply that copy and paste mechanism to the rest of the country, and it impoverishes us materially from an aesthetic, from a communal, and from a spiritual perspective.
Yeah, as a developer, can you make a difference? How can you influence this issue?
Absolutely. Developers are, if not the tip of the spear, very close up. So it's when folks are looking for answers as to why so much of the country looks the same, or why the state of new development is lacking so much, they often point at developers and they say, well, this is greed. This is point blank. It is the Philistine nature of greedy developers who want to value engineer structures down to their most basic core components. And if we just remove the profit imperative or those damn developers, things would be better. There's partly truth there. If I were to throw percentages at it, perhaps it's 25%, maybe upwards of a third. A strong developer can certainly do a lot.
Hmm.
What one needs
Good.
is you need architect to be on the same page. So the developer's not drawing the building, the architect is. And the architect may say, well, the developer didn't want me to spend all this money, but that's sort of a lazy excuse because we can build extraordinarily attractive places for not very much money. I can get into that in a sec. And arguably the most determinative factor in the quality of our built environment are the land use regulations and building codes that allow what needs to be built. And so it's surprising to people who don't have a planning or an architecture background to hear that most of what drives the building process is not the hand of the architect or the mind of the developer. It's the series of codes that both the architect and the developer must adhere to in order to build anything.
It sounds terrible.
It's terrible.
It sounds so bad. It's unfortunate.
And here's how bad it gets, Christina. There's a point where you submit your plans to the city and they say, all right, we're going to come back and review. Your building is too close to the street front. The windows are too large. You're using this material. We actually want you to use 3 other materials because you need to articulate the facade to deliver some level of intrigue. We noticed that you want to build straight up to the corner. You're at an intersection. And so if a car makes a left-hand turn and goes too fast through the light, they're going to smash into your building. So you need to cut away a portion of the building in the edge case that a car is going to ram into it.
Some of it makes sense, right? For safety reasons, but it seems like it's still over-regulated.
That's exactly right. So on their own, each individual piece of regulation may make sense, or they may be antiquated. There are certainly some anachronisms that have remained as vestiges in our contemporary practices. But when you throw them together, it results in a complex system where we don't know how they're going to react to each other. And there's very little ability to have responsiveness there. So if I were throwing percentages, perhaps it's 25 to 33% developers, architects, and then the balance is based off of the codes. But to get back to your question of developers, is it in our ability? If one is very thoughtful and considerate, yes, a developer can have an extraordinary influence because they choose the architect to work with. So now you're talking about anywhere from 50 to 67% of the ability to create a beautiful building. And that's really important. So it is incumbent on the developer, and not 100% though, back to the example. There are certain reasons why some developers are not able to deliver beautiful buildings. It goes beyond culture. It goes beyond aesthetic value, and it goes beyond capacity. It is the series of imperatives that must be met in order for any structure to get built. So what I mean by that is construction is very expensive. If you want to build a 10-unit apartment building in San Francisco, it might cost you $5 million, might cost you $6 million, could cost you 10. Who knows? It's going to be expensive. And so in order to build that, you need to go to investors, and investors require a certain level of return. It's a very risky endeavor, real estate development. You require a higher return than if you were to just put your money in the S&P 500 and shut the door and not think about it, right?
But hopefully there are investors that care about the future and something that will stay long after we're gone, right?
There are some.
Fide is not only numbers, but how you can make a difference in your community, in your city, in your country.
So there are some, and you're absolutely right. It is incumbent at the end of the day, I believe, on a group of investors who allows a developer to go out. So if we say that a developer is responsible for 50 to 67% of the quality of the building, the developer can't build anything if the investor doesn't support them. So you really need to bring that proportion of, one can call it blame, perhaps a better way to phrase it would be responsibility over the quality of the built environment, to the investors. And so an argument needs to be made to the limited partners, or LPs as they're known in real estate development, that you should support longer term development. You don't need to cycle your capital as quickly every 2 or 3 years, throwing up cheap products that will be demolished in 10, 15 years.
Yeah, build something you can be proud of. You look at something and people will walk around, or people will live, for example, in this building, if it's housing, right? It affects so many people. It affects how we feel, everything.
Yeah,
The quality of life for many people.
There are extraordinary qualitative and quantitative considerations and consequences to the way that we build. But that argument has to be made. And it's something that I've been trying to make on my own platform that some others, and not just some others, there are many others who are seeking to do this, and indeed who have done this over the last several decades. But on the whole, it perhaps to an outsider doesn't feel as though there's much of an impact because they're drops in the ocean. Most development that's carried out today is done by institutional builders, and is supported by institutions. The statistic that I've been using recently, of the most recent data rather, is that 25% of all multifamily development in the United States is carried out by just 25 firms. Now there's 60,000 at least, because I don't really know how they calculate these numbers, but 60,000 real estate developers in the US. For single family homes, it's even worse. The top 10 home builders control 43% of the market. So if you have that level of concentration, it's going to feel like everything looks the same.
The same, yeah.
Indeed, it does. But to bring some hope into the conversation, in recent years, there's been an enormous swell of small scale, local, regional builders who are making those arguments to investors. Look, I know it's not your 25% that you might be able to get with somebody else, but what about 20%? 20% returns are still extraordinary, or 18%, or whatever it is. Because mind you, the alternative is, should I go put my money in the S&P 500 and get 8 or 9%? Or should I go put it in some alternative asset and maybe get 18 to 20%? So you have to compete with investors on those terrains. So you can't say, I'm only going to give you 11%. That requires a really sympathetic and philosophically aligned investor. They exist, but they're more difficult to find.
I think, yeah, I think that most investors want to diversify, and I think we just need more education about it. I don't think many of them know that's the option and how it actually works. So I think you speaking up and explaining this issue can make a difference.
And it's eminently possible. You exactly as you say, Christina, is sort of the argument that I make, that one can't believe in something or indeed know of its existence unless they know of the existence of it. It is a catch-22. And so we need to have broader conversations about the possibility of doing this. And if investors are able to get on board, then the rest of it will flow.
Yeah. And it seems like your current projects are within limitations, right? You have a piece of land and you're developing some housing units. Let's imagine if you were giving a large piece of land with no limitations, financial limitations, I mean, like a magic wand, what would you do? I know it's a big question. You can talk about it for hours, right? But
hours and hours
give
and
us
hours.
some idea about, because I know that you have been thinking about this for many, many years.
Right.
So what would be your dream project? How would that look?
It's funny. I have just finishing this book that we'll talk about in a bit, but I've been working on another one for even longer that is not public, that is the culmination of all of these ideas. If someone gave me 25 square miles, what would I do with it? And so I can give you a very succinct answer.
Okay.
Oftentimes, there is a tendency amongst, I could say well-learned, but perhaps folks who are very educated in this realm, to over-intellectualize development. That's indeed what drove a lot of modernism. It was a highly intellectual and rational movement where entire cities were given over to this project. And they overthought it. We, highways running everywhere, large anonymous tower blocks, car dependency. It was a prescriptive way and a theoretical way of living, as opposed to one that is grounded in the reality of how people live. So the very short answer, what I would do with a
Not
25,
very short. Let's go.
let's go a little bit longer. The shorter answer, the non 10-hour answer, is that we only need to look at the places that are already working well and copy them. And
Mm.
obviously you should apply some regional variation, but it's something I talk about in the book called good artist copy, great artist steal. If there's something you really like, and that's not an original thought, this is stolen directly from
Global
somebody else.
perspective, right?
It's a great idea. Exactly. That if Florence is this exceptional city and the component parts of Florence are so wonderful, why won't they work in New York or California? Of course they will. So let's take the building blocks that work well there, the streets that are maybe only 6 to 8 feet wide, that meander and curve, and they have all of these really attractive components. The default layer of mixed use on a lot of ground floors, not everywhere, but to allow it wherever it wants to manifest so that there's a shop to go by or an office or some level of dynamism on the street. Building with natural materials such that it's not all glass or concrete or steel everywhere. These are, in some respects, they're natural materials. In some respects, they're synthetic, depending on the combinations. But they're not traditional materials. We have not evolved to, in some respects, psychologically and others, physiologically, to be attracted to these places. There's this notion, I won't go too deeply into it, of thermoception, where our bodies respond to different temperatures of different places. You don't want to build a brutalist concrete structure in Boston, for example, because concrete retains that coldness. It's gray. It is not a very warm structure, and you don't want that in a place that's going to be 10 degrees in the winter. So, and snowing. So we need to respond to the local context using the traditional wisdom of 1,000 years of accumulated history and learnings in the built environment, and then be unafraid to experiment with certain things. But when we experiment with those things, be it a new style of architecture, a new typology of building, whatever it might be, if it doesn't seem to be working, we have to cut it short, and be willing to try new. So there are people around the world who are doing this at varying scales. There's Poundbury in Dorset in England, that now King Charles is administered, but when he was the Prince of Wales, it was his project that he had overseen. There's 𝒷𝓇𝓊𝒾𝓃𝓄𝓎 in Guatemala. There is California Forever, in which perhaps you're familiar with, in Solano County in the Bay Area. That is a very interesting project. And there are a number of others worldwide that are seeking to effectuate good urbanism and attractive, desirable placemaking. But at the end of the day, I think the answers are rely on what's worked historically, steal from the best cities in the world, whether that's Amsterdam or San Miguel de Allende or Buenos Aires or Marrakesh. Steal the good. If you had an unlimited amount of money, build some extraordinary monuments that really call to the spirit of humanity, to create true icons. But they shouldn't be everywhere, because then they overwhelm you. Maybe the Duomo in Florence, for example, is so extraordinary because it can be seen from everywhere else in the city. It stakes the claim. Whereas in New York City, St. Patrick's Cathedral is a stunning work of architecture, but it gets completely lost in the flood of skyscrapers that are around it. So there's this diagram from the architect and theorist and planner Leon Carrère, res economus, res publica civitas. I may have gotten the name a little bit wrong, but it says just this. There needs to be fabric buildings and then some monuments that punctuate the rest of it. Make sure that it responds to local character, and then be unafraid to experiment.
And I feel like we need more squares or places where people can interact.
Oh, that's absolutely a critical part of this equation. Third places where people can hang out outside of their home, outside of their office, especially in this world of remote work where I might not leave my apartment for a couple of days, right? You need to be able to pull people together and give them
Socialize, we're social creatures.
We're social creatures, but in places that don't require you to spend $7 for a coffee to hang out with your friends, or $25 to go to the movies. We need places we could just, and so there are wonderful precedents from around the world, whether it's the 𝒞𝓃𝓃𝓃𝓎 in Copenhagen that one wants to apply, whether it's Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo is quite uh, at the other end of the spectrum, I would say, but it is a miraculous place in many respects. But places that are built for and around people. And I think important in this conversation, I probably diverge from a lot of urbanists in this respect. There is a place for cars in this idealized city, but they're a tool. The city should not be built around the tool. It would be as though you constructed a home full of, uh, but did not hammer in all of the nails, just so that whenever you walk by something, you could use your hammer. It
Mm.
doesn't make sense. In the same way that you shouldn't build the city around a car just so that you have the optionality to use your car whenever you want it. It should be there for folks who need it. There are certainly those who are infirm or handicapped, or perhaps just don't want to be on their feet after an entire day of being on their feet, who can make use of cars, but they should be subservient to all other modes of transportation, in my opinion.
Frank Lloyd Wright. The mother art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization. Without a distinct architectural identity, a civilization loses its unique character and soul, doesn't it?
The point here is that the architecture is like the soul of art and soul of the city. I was wondering how buildings and our living environment can affect humans generally.
It affects humans in so many almost incalculable ways. And it's, for example, it's very difficult to know if one was raised in Boston, for example, whether they would be the same person if they were raised in Phoenix. I'm of the belief that they probably wouldn't. I mean, this gets to the nature versus nurture conversation, but I think environment plays a great role. You know, part of that's culture. If one grew up in Texas as opposed to Minnesota, there's a highly higher likelihood that one will play football if you're a boy growing up, as opposed to hockey, let's just say.
Mhm.
So there are those cultural differences, certainly, but there are also physiological and psychological differences where if one is used to biking everywhere, as I was growing up, I was very fortunate to be able to be raised in places where I could bike around
Mhm.
most places. That instilled in me a level of independence from an early age where I could take a bike and go wherever, meet my friends, go grab some food, or do nothing at all, particularly if I just wanted to get out of the house. And I think that if I lived in somewhere where I couldn't do that, it would change who I was. From a psychological perspective, beyond childhood, our buildings materially impact our mental health and our.
That's interesting. This is so interesting to me.
There's a book. It's called Welcome to Your World by Sarah Williams Goldhagen, and this is a premature book recommendation. How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives is the subtitle.
Mhm.
It's been one of the most instructive.
I will read this one. Very interesting. Yeah.
So the thrust of this, and it can be a little academic at points, but
Mhm.
it has been as influential on my development uh, of worldview as any other text, is that the quality of place impacts how we feel and how we move about space. So to take one example, if a classroom of students, 20 students, for example, were crammed in to a basement with very low ceilings, with
Mm,
popcorn ceilings and vinyl floors and
yeah.
LED lighting, does does that sound as appealing of a place to learn as somewhere that has a view into a garden, has large windows, has
Mm,
natural lighting, has perhaps wood and other materials inside that
I
are
love that. Yeah.
and not only and so I think anyone would say, well, of course, you'd rather be in the garden with large windows and natural materials built around. But it turns out that empirically, there are massive differences and divergences between the realms in which kids study. if it is true, which indeed it is, because there have been studies and meta-analyses and meta-studies of these, then there is perhaps nothing more important that we could be doing than to be developing and building schools that are far more conducive to learning than simply utilitarian, here's a box for one to live in. And you can apply that same principle to everywhere. Would one rather walk on a street that is next to an 8-lane highway with large concrete buildings next door, or would you rather walk on a tree-lined street that is narrow and gently hugs you and has buildings that rise 4 to 5 stories and there's cafes on the corner with people out on the street? Of course, there's no difference. There's no question that these differences are so material that one would rather be in that very beautiful and attractive human scale, gently dense environment.
Even colors affect us differently, right?
Affect us differently. We like warm colors. We like reds and oranges. We don't like grays, and we don't like the dark grays and blacks. It really brings down our. So there are any number of anecdotes that can be brought about, but it is undeniably true that the built environment impacts us at a deep psychological and physiological level. And it should be incumbent on city planners, on architects and developers to internalize that and to create places that can render us or can deliver rather the most optimal living experience.
Wonderful. Could you please tell us about your book?
Yeah, so
you light it up right away.
No, it's funny because this, Welcome to Your World was an inspiration in many respects. Welcome to Your World is more of a psychological and neurological analysis of how people move through space, and I implement some of those lessons throughout the book. But broadly, what my book is why the world looks the way it does and how to make it better. So the first half is a history of the American built environment from the Industrial Revolution to the present day. There are a series of decisions that we've made over the last 150 years. Really, in this book, I focus in on the last 100 that explain why, for example, we drive cars everywhere in the United States, or why we have large subdivisions, single-family home communities to get to some of the things that we were talking about before, and why we don't build as perhaps European cities have, or Latin American or Asian cities, or in fact, how we used to build 100 years ago, pre-World War II and really pre-Great Depression, let's say. So those decisions that we've made have had a profound influence on our world. And I argue in this book that they've had deleterious impact and real negative consequences. But the hopeful part of the book, the title after all is called Building Optimism. We want to and that hopefulness in people is that we can change all of it. Our world is not some immutable reality that we are subjected to and that we have no agency over changing. Every place that even when you're in the wilderness, it's often the case that humans have had some influence over shaping it. Unless someone drops you into the Canadian Rockies 300 miles away from the closest city, it's likely that everywhere you go is influenced by humans in some way. And so if that is true, which indeed it is, why can't we have influence positively changing? Of course we can. So all that requires to get started is a belief that it's possible. Because I've found that oftentimes people don't question the world around them. They take it as it is, or rather cynically, they'll say, we can't do anything about that. That's just the way it is. And it's just not true. It's just not the way the world is. We have succumbed to this really
I love your optimism. That's wonderful.
But it's true. It's not some blind naivete or utopianism. It's really true. And so to transition from the history of where we are and why we need to change to what we can actually do, I employ what I call romantic pragmatism. So
Mm.
there's a lot of people who are blind optimists or romantics, right? And they'll say, I wish everything was $5. Every apartment was $5. Everyone should live in a 6,000 square foot home. We should all be able to have any number of things, right? Beautiful, right? It's wonderful ideals. It's not possible. So
And
we
no,
have
not everyone wants the same thing, Joe. Not
not
everyone
everyone.
wants to live in 6,000 square feet house. It depends. Yeah,
And back to the
so
point of
different.
if I could build a 25 square mile city, I don't know that it would be the best city. I know it wouldn't be the best city in the world because any great place is shaped by many hands. Even if you were the most enlightened thinker on the built environment imaginable, it's still only one idea. Your values are going to be very different from someone else's, and that's okay. We shouldn't seek to inflict them upon others. Um, there needs to be some level of permissiveness, right? That people can shape the world towards their own ends, and then that leads to a beautiful diversity of places and types of people. So with that, we have this utopianism that may or may not be good, and on one end of the spectrum, and on the other, we have this deep pragmatism that says we just need to build boxes for people, you know, stuff them in. We have a housing crisis. Build 25-story towers, 50-story towers. Doesn't matter what it looks like. Doesn't matter if we have to tear it down 20 years. We have this utilitarian need that needs to be satisfied. And that's of course wrong too, because that deprives the humanity of the people who live in those spaces. So we need to find a convergence for those romantic ideals and pursuits with actually being able to meet our needs. And that's what I call
Yeah,
this
more
romantic.
practical approach.
That's exactly right. And but not to lose the optimism, to keep both. And so in the second half of the book, I explore in quite depth, or quite a good bit of depth, how this would actually be carried out. So it's not saying, waving my wand and going, this is the way. It gets into some level of analytical detail to say, okay, do you want to build a beautiful building? Here's how much it costs. Do you wonder why certain streets are more dynamic than others? Well, here's what goes into the financing of, let's say, retail establishments or scales, and why, for example, is a city like Charleston very successful, whereas Atlantic City has not been successful? Here are the exact series of decisions that each of these cities have made over the last 40 years and why there's been a divergence in their outcomes. And so there are a lot of very tangible examples from the individual building level all the way up to the city level that whether you're a developer, you're an urban planner, you're an architect, or a public official can take and apply to their day-to-day life in order to improve the quality of their communities.
But it seems like this regulatory environment is the biggest issue. Elon Musk said that it seems like he can build a rocket faster than get all the approvals. So is it the same in your world? And what
Yeah.
needs to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an entire chapter of the book is dedicated to reining in superfluous regulations. And when one says that, it's you can easily be labeled, let's say, as some demagogic figure or whatever political ideology the person who opposes that belief believes in. So I make this joke often. Depending on let's say I post or write about a building. It could be a 5-story, beautiful apartment building. 50% of it is reserved for affordable housing for seniors. There's a cafe and a grocery store on the ground floor. Five different people could look at that and say, one could say, oh, that's amazing. I really support it. Second could say, that's a communist imposition that you're inflicting on me. I don't want an apartment building. The third could say, that's fascistic for X, Y, and Z reasons. I don't like the style. Fourth could say, you're a libertarian, you don't want there to be any level of regulation. You want people to be harmed. And the fifth can be a melange of all of them, right? And so it's difficult to have these conversations in a hyper-partisan society, but it is in fact true that the reason why we have devolved to in the way that we have societally is that we're overregulated. And
And I'm
it
all for safety.
we need to have a
We do
core
need
level.
some regulations, but it seems like
It is
too
that's why I
much.
say it's superfluous. There is a non-zero amount of regulations that should exist. We have overshot it by quite some amount. So just to give you one statistic, the National um, Multifamily Housing Council, NMHC, has come out with data that shows that upwards of 41% of all of the costs of an apartment building are attributable to regulations. So that could be parking spaces that cost $50,000 each. It could be a certain level of electric line usage, or a water line that has to be 2 inches instead of 3/4. It could be fire safety systems. So instead of having just sprinklers, you need to have a certain level of fire treatment or fire safety for or sorry, fire rating for material. You need to have two means of egress. You need to have two elevators. You need to have adaptable bathrooms. All of these things. There is a baseline level of health and safety that all developers want to adhere to.
Yeah.
That's great. It should not be that, if your apartment is $2,000, that fully, uh, you know, or I'll just make it even simpler, that if it's $1,000, that $400 and $2,800 are attributable to regulations. That is an imposition on the most marginalized people in society, and it's why we really aren't able to build affordably, because it's very difficult to do it when you have all of
Hard to
these.
stay optimistic after listening to what you're saying.
So
I'm
it is
surprised you.
hard to stay optimistic, but the reason why I am is that we can change all of this. And all it requires is to be able to have good faith and honest conversations with legislators and practitioners in the built environment to say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. City Council member, I understand that your concern is for fire safety. Let's take it back from a conversation about regulations. Let's ask, what do you want to accomplish?
Yeah.
Do you want to provide a safe living environment? Okay,
That's what needs to be done for it.
let's roll it back. Let's get to a first principles approach and ask, what do we want to do? And once we figure that out, then we can chart a better course. But as I say in the book, and as I've mentioned to others, right now we sort of operate on a palimpsest. We scroll out regulations. There's still vestiges there, so they manifest in ways that we can't really anticipate. And we write on top of each other, one after another, after another, after another. And this leads to massive unintended consequences. So we need to scale that back and start anew in many cases and say, well, what are we looking to do? And I'll give one example tangibly, so this doesn't seem abstract and that people have nothing to take away. We're building in a community in upstate New York called Kingston. It's 100 miles north of New York City. It is one of the first state capital of the state of New York, originally a Dutch village and British. It has this extraordinarily beautiful historic core. The city of Kingston recently reformed its zoning code and adopted a form-based code, such that it sort of cleared the decks of a lot of those vestiges of mid-century and early 20th century regulations that in truth were very discriminatory and very destructive to economic productivity. And now it's extraordinarily permissive, where our buildings are still going to adhere to building codes. That's the basic building safety. We still have to get approval from the fire department, but we basically don't have to adhere to 60 to 80% of the regulations we might in another community just 5 miles down the road.
That's great.
We don't have parking minimums. We don't have a floor area ratio minimum. We can, there's a height limitation, but that's fine. That's doable. We don't have to move. We could spread across almost as much of the lot as we want. There are parts of the lots that we're not going to have. There are allowances for certain housing typologies that wouldn't be allowed in other communities because they're too dense or because the unit sizes are too small. So I could give several dozen examples.
No, that makes sense.
There's communities that are allowing for this around the country, and ultimately they will win out because developers are not going to work in the sorts of places that make it so hard for us to build any housing, we're going to opt out. I'm going to go to Kingston. Elon Musk is going to
Exactly.
go to Texas. We're, and we've seen the Sun Belt take this growth over the last 3-4
And will
decades.
make housing more affordable, right?
That's absolutely right. And so that gets back to first principles. Do we care about the regulations or do we care about affordability? Do we care about safety or do we care about adhering to some line of code that someone wrote 70 years ago? What matters to us? And optimistically, when you have these conversations with city officials, you can get down to brass tacks and say, Mrs. Mayor, you don't actually care about section 27, subsection 63, line 46. It doesn't matter to you. You care that the people who are living in that apartment building, who are working in that office building, everything else is just noise. And so I think when you bring it down to a human level, people understand that.
That's wonderful. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you.
Congratulations. I know it's a lot of work, but it's good to take it all out of your mind and put it on paper and share it with the world, right?
At least getting it out of your mind. If not being shared broadly, there's a lot swimming up there. And so it's good to clear the mind once in a while.
Yeah. And you mentioned affordable housing. I think that's a huge issue here in the United States. First of all, it's very interesting that here in the US, we have only approximately 37% of people who actually paid off their house.
Everybody else is paying rent or mortgage.
And that is very difficult. People feel stressed because of that. Life would be so much easier if you could own your place and worry about groceries, and other things, clothing. And normally, I think in the world, it's around 50%. So in the United States, situation is worse than in many countries. We're the richest country in the world, and we're in this situation. And the houses are so expensive. I know you have a lot of thoughts on it, but if there's anything you could share with us.
Yeah, so there's a lot of places one could take this. I'll start by saying it's a huge problem. Upwards of half of all renters are rental households are burdened by costs, which is an extraordinarily high percentage. And for those who own their homes, they're not out of the woods just because they bought their house. There is this ratio called price to income ratio. So means what it says. What is the price of the home versus one's income? And I believe in San Francisco, I don't know if it's the highest in the country, but it's very high.
Yeah.
One would have to, the median salary, let's just say it's $100,000, would have to make that for 10 years in order to be able to afford the median home. It's $1 million. So they have a price to income ratio of 10 to 1. The trouble with that is your $100,000 is not actually $100,000. It is, there's taxes, there's cost of living, there is schooling for one's children, perhaps, there's transportation, there's quality of life. Do I want to go see a show? Do I want to go watch a sports game? So what is one actually able to save at the end of the year? For a lot of people, their savings rate might be 4, 5, 6%. So if that's the case, you're only bringing in $4,000 to $6,000 a year, you're never going to be able to afford a home for $1 million. There's just no chance. And so, and of course, that 4 to 5% assumes that a portion of your money is going towards rent or a portion is going towards your mortgage. But it is true that it's never been more unaffordable to buy a home than today in America. How do we solve that? There are a number of federal changes that can be made. There is, of course, there's tax credits. There are FHA-backed loans that allow one to put a lower portion of money down for a loan. There are grants that can be provided for folks of certain level of incomes. But I think all of this is really downstream of the true issue. You're sort of treating the symptoms, not the cause. And the cause is that there's not enough housing in the places that need it. If one
I think politicians are talking about unemployment rates, but people are not afraid of losing their jobs. They're afraid of ending up on the street because the rent is so expensive, mortgage payments are so expensive. It's all related to having affordable housing for everyone. And in many countries, like I said, I was born in Soviet Union.
In Russia and in Ukraine, the right to housing is a constitutional right.
And that makes sense.
According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory, human motivation is driven by a series of hierarchical needs, starting with the basic physiological needs and progressing towards self-actualization. 1. Physiological needs: air, food, water, shelter, and other basic survival needs. 2. Safety needs: personal security, health, financial stability, and safety. 3. Love and belonging: relationships, friendships, family, and social connections. 4. Esteem needs: respect, self-esteem, recognition, and a sense of accomplishment. 5. Self-actualization: personal growth, creativity, achieving one's full potential, and self-fulfillment. People must have their basic needs met before they can focus on higher-level needs. Physiological needs are essential for survival and human dignity.
Like anything can happen in people's lives, right? Everybody come from different backgrounds, different families. So people want
That's
to
right.
feel protected.
It's an existential need to have secure housing, and we have failed as a nation. California, I was just doing some research this morning, has 180,000 homeless individuals at any point in time. The pit counts, and that is unacceptable to me. It is intolerable, and I think it's a sort of villainy that doesn't get called out enough. There is unfortunately a level of blame that gets ascribed to those who are homeless, but one can become homeless for any number of reasons. They might have a medical bill that
Mostly
is
mental issues too. That's another issue. Yes.
issues. There can be, but a lot of times, and folks who are homeless, we don't see them on the street. They're sleeping on their sister's couch or they're in a shelter. And
In the car, sometimes if they
every
go
part,
through
yeah,
transitions, just lost their job and their apartment. Yeah.
that's exactly right. And so if you can't make your mortgage or you can't make your rent, you fall down precariously into this ladder. And the solution, there are all a number of solutions, and we could spend another several hours talking
Yeah.
about, is really to just
Bill.
provide housing needed and to build, build, build. Of course, there will always be people who need to be provided for. The government should still have housing vouchers. There's a housing choice voucher. There's some Section 8 vouchers.
There's not enough houses.
It's
Soviet Union in 1950s, 1960s, Khrushchev built so many apartments for 80 million people. Those apartments are very small, like kitchens are very small, bedrooms are very small, but everyone had something because it's constitutional right.
That's right. Well,
Yeah.
it's great that you say that, because I've gotten flack for this in the past from folks who have not interacted as intimately with, let's say, the homeless community or those who are precariously housed. In the 60s, 70s, sort of started to change in the 70s and 80s. We used to have what are called SROs in the United States, the single resident occupancy or single occupancy in some places, whereby it was very modest. They used to call them flop houses in the 1920s and 30s, but you got a bed, you shared a bathroom, you had somewhere to rest your head at night and to be
Yeah.
safe. And we outlawed them. You can't build them anymore. They were deemed to be too small. So that, these might have been 200 square
Yeah,
feet.
it's better on the street, more space than those small houses. It's like, what's it's
What are
nonsense.
we doing here? What are we doing? That it's better, exactly, better for someone to be on the street. And so solving the housing crisis requires housing consumption at levels that might, for some people, be too low and for others to be too much, right? There are going to be some folks who maybe only want a 200 square foot home. There are others who want a 10,000 square foot home if their needs, or if rather they can afford that.
Yeah.
But we need to build these different forms. I mean, the one stat that I'll point to where people say housing is so unaffordable, how can you ever afford it? we need to have all this level of intervention. We don't need intervention in Gary, Indiana, or in St. Louis, Missouri. Homes are very affordable there. It's
Mm.
the case that there aren't as many jobs there, and there's not as much
It's all connected. You
all
touch
connected.
on one issue, it's related to another.
Exactly. And
Oh,
so
but
we
you
but
have to,
those
yeah, you have to address it one way or another. But yes,
you have
it's definitely yeah, America is a huge country and there's so much land, but people live in certain places
that's
and
right.
the housing is so expensive. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Now people are moving to Texas. It's going to be the same story if everyone moves there. It's
If
going to
they
get
don't
more
change
and
the
more
zoning,
expensive.
they've got to change the zoning codes. And if they get out in front of it, which Houston has done and Austin has now adopted, Dallas is tinkering on the edges. Those places are actually retaining their affordability because they're making accommodation. They're learning from the lessons of San Francisco and New York, who have not reformed their ways, unfortunately, and they're still relatively affordable. Now, things will get more expensive, of course, but it's not the case that Texas is fated to become more expensive. They just need to adopt a series of decisions that will allow for more people to live there. And Houston has been the case study in that so far. They've done an
Mhm.
extraordinary job.
I would love to move to Texas. Like then I look at the houses that I could afford there or here in San Francisco Bay Area. It makes big difference. You get more for your money.
You, there are so there are a lot of
Denver is
people.
nice here though.
Bay Area is incredible, and California has unfortunately failed its residents because it is arguably the most felicitous place on earth to live, the most well-suited place for people to
Beautiful.
live.
Yeah.
Climate is stunning, the natural wonders are extraordinary. There should be 200 million people in California, and we could house them. The density of California is not very high, um, but the struggle is the legislators have not made accommodation for it. And there's all level of excuse that is thrown about that people are moving to Texas because it's more politically aligned with their beliefs. It's not true at all. People are moving to Texas because you can afford to buy a 4,000 square foot home with 5 bedrooms for $400,000 in the heart of a city. That's why people are moving. There's more job opportunity. There's more ability. It gets back to regulation, it gets back to opportunity, it gets back to one marrying theory with reality. In California, New York, and I can say this because I've lived in both places. I'm a New Yorker. I currently work in both states. This is not me throwing pot shots
Yeah,
from
you
someone.
know what you're saying. Yeah.
They have failed their constituents, they have failed their residents, and the United States benefits from having 50 separate state governments in competition with one another. And so where California and New York have failed, Texas and Arizona and Colorado and Utah have taken advantage of it. And that's going to
Florida too, right?
do. Yep, exactly. Exactly.
I wanted to ask you to recommend some books for people who become more interested in this subject after listening to this dialogue.
I've got quite a few up here and then some over here. So the first, before I give any other, is going to be Welcome to Your World.
Yeah,
Like I said before,
I'll read
if
this one. Yeah.
if you want to understand why you feel good, let's say walking in a small street in Philadelphia, and why you don't feel so good on a wide street in Phoenix,
Mm.
the answer's there. It is perhaps the most mind-opening book that I've ever read. For other urbanists, I would say that, you know, Jane Jacobs' um, Death and Life of Great American Cities is a seminal text. A lot of urbanists view it as the Bible of urbanism. It is well worth the read, and I think it has largely stood the test of time. I'm going to choose another from Witold Rubachensky called Charleston Fancy. It details the story of a series of developers and architects and builders and public officials in Charleston over the course of 40 years. And for anyone who's been to Charleston recently, Christina, have you been or have you?
No, no.
Extraordinary city. A series of discrete policy and development decisions that have been made that have not only preserved the character of the city, but have made it such that the quality of new development is higher here than anywhere else in the country. So you could read this in a couple of days. It's engaging. It is optimistic and hopeful. It's terrific. So I guess those will be my three. There's any number of hundreds here that one can recommend, but I think those are the ones that I'm going to go with.
All right, next time you'll give us
I'll
next
give a couple
year.
more at least.
We can do it again next
That'd
year.
be terrific. That'd be terrific.
Yeah. The last question I ask everyone on my podcast: what does kindness mean to you?
I love the question. When you sent them over earlier today, or yesterday rather, it was, I think, a fitting mark to end on. I think kindness can be defined most simply as a compassion for others, for thinking about others. There are ways in which it can perhaps be cynical, a kindness. I'm going to hold open the door for you because I expect that you're going to pay for my pizza when we get into the shop, right? I don't know if it needs to be wholly altruistic, because sometimes a kindness can benefit you, and I don't think that's something that we should look down upon. If we can nudge people to be more compassionate for others, even if it's in their own self-interest, I think that's all right. But broadly, I think when people move outside of their core groups of friends or family members, we become dispassionate and we lose that ability to connect with others. And I won't go so far as to say that America has become unkind or make a sweeping statement. I don't think that's true at all. I think most people are kind at a local level. It might just be to their mom or to their dog or to their minister or whoever it might be. But the challenge for us is, how do we broaden the circle of kindness such that you treat the stranger on the street with perhaps not as much fidelity as you might to your mother or to your wife or husband or partner, but to view them in all of their humanity and to be compassionate with who they are. So a lot of places that
I love that. No, that's beautiful. I love that. And what you're doing, building new developments for people, it's being kind because you're creating something that will bring happiness to many. So thank you for doing that. And thank you for talking about all these issues, because I'm sure all of us, we all want to see this change,
Well, I really appreciate your having me on today, and I hope that we can be only half as successful as we plan to be, and that we can improve the lives of even just a couple of people. But if not, the pursuit is well worth it.
Thank you so much.